Part 2. Chapter 7. They rowed all day, always south, in sight of the shore, so they could see if the strange boats had pulled up anywhere. Ben strained his eyes for any glimpse of them. Iba slept, curled at his feet. Issika laid her scarf over Iba's face to shelter her from the sun. They rowed. Occasionally they rested and ate a little of the food Jerutha had packed for them. Benaim felt that he was in a dream world, overwhelmed by loss and the newness of everything, their sudden homelessness. They were lost and adrift, a 14-year-old girl, a 13-year-old boy, and their little 7-year-old sister. What good were they against the world? Who were those people? He asked his sister, but she had no answer for him. He had never seen people or boats like that before, and especially never animals like those gray shapes swimming in the water. "Ben," Issika said, her voice low, "are they going to feed him to those animals?" A chill made Ben's arms prickle. He felt sick. He glanced down at Iba, but she was still fast asleep, exhausted from crying. "Let's not think about that," he said. "It's too horrible." "Were they slave ships then?" The workers told stories about boats rowed by people who stole children to be slaves. Many people didn't allow their children to go to the harbor. Unknown people were rumored to paddle in from the sea and snatch up unwary children, taking them to large ships filled with stolen children. No children had been taken from the worker village for many years. Ben's father said it was because the sea gate was doing its job. Still, the slave ships lived on in the children's nightmares. "The boats in the stories have strange eyes painted on them," he told his sister. "Those boats didn't have paintings, did they?" He felt nauseous at the thought of his brother being taken as a slave. He set his face and rowed harder. And if they reached the boats that had taken their brother, what would they do then? It didn't matter. He rowed. In the late afternoon, as the sea was turning to gold, they pulled to the shore. Ben shook with exhaustion. One look at his sister told him she had no strength left. He looked around. Ben had never seen anything like the place where they landed. The shore was covered with a soft layer of pale golden dirt, which, when he looked closer, wasn't dirt, but a collection of the tiniest of rocks. They ran through Ben's fingers as he dipped his hands into piles of them. Iba sat and began playing with the dirt immediately, scooping handfuls and letting the soft substance flow through her fingers. "Sand," Ben said. "It's called sand." Issika looked at him. "How?" "From the desert, Issika, you remember." She stared at him, then laughed. "I remember dirt, brother." "There was sand, too. And there was sand in the walled city." He met her eyes briefly, then looked away and tried to rub the soreness out of his arms. His back burned and his hands were torn up and covered with blisters, some of them bleeding. They were lost. They couldn't go back, and they didn't have Kital. He glared at his hands, wondering whether he could tear a piece of his shirt away to bind them in the morning. He supposed they would keep rowing and searching for their brother. With his fingertips, he pulled one of Jerutha's parcels out of his pocket and found 3 helpings of the daily meal wrapped in a banana leaf. His stomach wanted to eat right through his rib cage and continue to eat everything in sight. "Why don't you ever talk about those days?" Issika asked. Her voice was weary. She had asked him 1,000 times. He didn't answer. He handed her one portion of food. "Iba, go wash your hands in the sea, then come back to eat," he said. As the little girl ran to do as he said, he looked up at Issika. She was still gazing at him, a stubborn look on her face, and he felt his own face soften as he saw her cuts and bruises again. He was sore from rowing. She must be sore from both rowing and being beaten, yet she hadn't complained. Ben admired his sister's strength, but he couldn't talk about those times. He couldn't talk about before. If his mind even reached toward the past, his whole spirit flinched away, the drums chanting doom. He had learned to make a box of it in his mind, keep any thoughts of that time tightly sealed away. It was the only way he could have peace. "I've never seen some of these trees before," he said. Issika turned her head, following the direction of his eyes. There were 3 types of trees in their village: the losh trees they used for fuel, the yuchi, a tall thin tree with curved leaves and pale bark that added no color to the landscape, and the banana trees, which offered the treasured fruit of their village. But these trees were different. They had landed on a short curved beach that bordered a jungle jumping with color. There were trees with wide leaves that were almost blue, and trees with thousands of tiny round leaves and long broad branches. One tree was so tall that Ben had to tip his head back to see the top of it. It dwarfed the other trees, with branches that curved snake-like, spilling from the tree's long limbs and curling up to climb again. Issika limped up the beach toward the tree. As she moved toward it, a large creature exploded from the leaves and leapt away farther into the jungle. Ben didn't see what it looked like. He had only the impression of size and speed. Issika turned to Ben, her eyes wide. "This place is alive," Iba said beside him. Ben nodded. The animal had startled him, but he felt wonder rather than fear. Iba came closer to him and put her small hand in his. He winced as she brushed against his blisters, but he didn't move away. His younger sister looked up at him, questions in her eyes, questions he couldn't even begin to answer. The voices inside him were silent, a welcome rest. He wondered what it meant that they were so quiet, but he relaxed into it, accepting the respite. "Okay, let's eat," Issika said, walking back toward them. "Then sleep. We'll have a big day tomorrow. We have to find Kital. But we should sleep down here on the sand. That jungle is a little too alive." The sun moved slowly toward the horizon. They were exhausted after rowing under the blazing sun all day. As they sat with their cold porridge, Issika and Ben barely able to use their hands, Ben thought of his father. His house was nearly empty now. Only Jerutha and her unborn baby left. Ben knew that his father's chief worry tonight, even as his children were in the wilderness, was that he wouldn't be saved from his illness after this giant rebellion against the goddesses. And who would he send into the temple to work at the shrine? Pregnant women were forbidden. Ben didn't know whether Nirloth would miss them, but then a memory came to him. It was from the terrible days after Ben's mother died. The old man had passed by Ben and paused to let one hand rest on his shoulder. Ben had flinched, expecting a rebuke, but Nirloth had simply squeezed Ben's shoulder with a gentle hand, then kept walking. Yes, Ben thought, he would miss them. In his heart, Ben felt something like satisfaction. Perhaps his father would finally see the value in what he had lost. "Let's go to sleep," Issika said. "Tomorrow we'll keep looking." Benyim looked at her. The setting sun glowed on her face. A rush of things came to his mind, things he wanted to say, 1,000 reasons this plan wouldn't work. They had already failed. But she looked both tired and very brave, so he lay down and arranged his cloak around him. Within moments, he was asleep. Issika slept a deep, dreamless sleep. When she opened her eyes, the sun was rising and the last stars were disappearing. She was warm. She was too warm, actually. She pulled her cloak off and sat up. The air was wonderful on her face. Issika remembered that they hadn't found Kital, which gave her a momentary flash of fear. But despite the memory of the day before, there was a feeling in her heart that slowly grew. She almost couldn't name it. She sat and smiled for several moments before she realized that she felt happy. They were outside under a blue sky. The trees of the jungle shook lightly in a morning breeze. She stood and stretched, looking around her. Ben sat at the shoreline near the water. She walked to him and sat down. They looked out across the sea, so blue, as clear as the well water at home. Just beyond the breakers, which were about as tall as Issika's knees, fish darted in and out of plants that grew underwater, waving as the little waves shook them back and forth. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice full of the awe she felt. "I don't know," Ben replied, and she sat up straighter and looked at him. Normally he spoke quietly, and Issachar often had to strain to hear or ask him to repeat himself. This morning was different. His voice rang out in the morning air, and Iba stirred in her sleep. "It's beautiful," he said, and she recognized the expression on his face because it was the same way she felt. It was peace. Issachar felt the need to get going and find Kital. She knew they had to discuss the best way to do that, but for the moment, she felt peace. Ben reached out and took one of her hands, turning it over so the palm was up. She looked at him, then at her hand, and it took her a minute, but when she saw what he was showing her, she gasped and brought her hands closer to her face. Her hands were smooth and free from wounds. The deep weeping blisters of the night before were gone, as though they had never been there. She didn't have an ache in her back or neck either, and as Ben lifted a hand to her face, she realized that the cuts and bruises her father had left on her body and cheek were gone. "What is this place?" she breathed, and Benihim shook his head at her, smiling. "I hoped you would know." "You hoped I would know? Do you think I've been exploring magic landscapes while you've been sleeping? This is amazing, Ben. What is happening?" He shrugged, his eyes wide. "It's like I want to worry about Kital, but I can't find the fear," he said. "I feel sure that we'll find him, but I don't know why." Issachar nodded. She felt the same way. She looked at the water. It was so clear she wanted to touch it. She got up and walked the short distance, splashing her hand around in the shallows. As she did, a strange feeling of joy bloomed inside her. "Let's get into the water," she said. "We need to bathe to keep from smelling enough to bring the villagers right to us." Ben nodded. Just then, Iba stood up, rubbing her eyes and walking toward them. "Bathe? Where?" she asked. "In there," Ben said, pointing at the calm, endless sea, and Iba's eyes widened as her smile overtook half her face. They stripped to their underclothes, and Issachar felt like a tiny girl without her heavy dress, her arms and legs poking out of her sleeveless shirt and shorts. She looked at her long, skinny brown legs and Ben's long, skinny brown arms, and she laughed. Iba danced on the sand beside her. They ran straight into the sea. The water was warm, and it felt like the sweetest bird song on the days when Issachar could pretend that her mother was still alive. It was like the embrace of her mother. It brought tears to her eyes, so she blinked them away and moved her arms and legs. She dunked her face into the water. She surfaced, took a deep breath, then pushed herself straight down until she was eye to eye with the fish at the bottom. She swam. Ben and Iba swam as well. They circled each other in the water, slapping at the surface, splashing. Ben was smiling so wide that Issachar could see every one of his teeth, and Iba tried to imitate the swimming of the fish-like animals they had seen the day before. All at once, submerged in water, Issachar knew that the people who had taken Kital had never fed children to those animals. The gray fish couldn't live in this sea and eat small children. The whole sea was alive with joy, the water perfect, warm, and yet refreshing. Tiny drops of water shot straight into the sky from the tops of the waves and caught the light, shining for a moment like stars. Issachar, Ben, and Iba climbed out after a long while, lying in the sun to dry. Issachar felt the sun's warmth on her face, and for the first time in her life, it felt friendly. She was just thinking they needed to get back in their boat and continue the search when there was a sudden whirring. A breeze lifted fallen leaves from the sand. Something large flew over Issachar, and she sat up, her heart pounding.